under oath that you told him that the gunshot wound came first, right?
I'm not aware of that.
You're not aware of that?
No.
Since last trial, last year, you haven't spoken with Detective Flores about that?
No.
So then, Detective Flores was asked by Mr. Martinez.
Objection and proper impeachment. That he's not aware of it, wasn't present.
Approach, please. Approach, please. You may proceed.
Thank you. Dr. Horton, isn't it true that you had a conversation with Detective Flores in 2009?
At the time of the autopsy, we probably discussed the case, yes.
Okay, well, the autopsy was June 12th of 2008, right?
Right.
And so, isn't it true that you talked to him about August 6th of 2009?
I don't recall that, no.
Well, Detective Flores testified under oath.
Yeah, an objection, lack of foundation.
I didn't finish
The question.
Detective Flores testified under oath that he specifically spoke to you on August 6th of 2009. Is that, you're saying that didn't happen?
It may have happened, I just don't recall that conversation.
Oh, okay, so you don't recall.
That's right.
Okay. All right. And, well, then you recall having a conversation with Detective Flores then at some point about the sequencing of injuries, don't you?
No.
Recall having a conversation with Detective Flores that you told him that the gunshot wound would not render Mr. Alexander unconscious?
Again, I don't recall having that conversation, no.
Okay. And do you remember having a conversation then with Detective Flores looking over the scene photographs?
No.
So Detective Flores testified under oath in 2009 that after looking at the scene photographs, that's when you decided that it would not have completely incapacitated somebody. And you're talking about he was talking about the gunshot wound. And with the scene photographs that we, meaning Detective Flores and you, discussed together, he believed, or you believed, that the gunshot wound was the first instance.
Objection, lack of foundation.
There's no foundation.
Well, is there a question? Did you finish your question?
I did finish my question.
Approach, please. You may continue.
Horn, you remember then, do you recall having a conversation with Detective Flores about whether or not a bullet wound to the frontal lobe would immediately incapacitate someone?
No.
And so then, are you aware that Detective Flores testified under oath that you told him that a bullet wound to the frontal lobe would not immediately incapacitate someone?
Objection and proper impeachment. Asked and answered.
That's what we just discussed.
Overruled. You may answer.
Sorry, can you ask that again?
Sure. Are you aware that Detective Flores testified under oath that you told him that a bullet wound to the frontal lobe of Mr. Alexander's brain would not immediately incapacitate?
Just from you telling me now, yes.
Okay, so you weren't aware of that.
No.
And during this same conversation that Detective Flores says you had, do you remember or do you recall discussing with him the scene photographs and discussing the fact that there's defensive wounds?
I have no recollection of any conversations with Detective Flores.
Okay, so are you aware then that Detective Flores testified under oath that you told him that after looking at the scene photographs that you discussed together, that's why you believed that the gunshot wound came first?
Objection, asked and answered. Compound question and proper impeachment.
Overruled. You may answer.
Again, just from you telling me now, no, I'm not aware.
You don't remember talking about this last year?
No, not in detail.
Okay, and since last year, when you've previously testified in trial, you never talked to Detective Flores about it?
About this case, no.
Yes. You never clarified with him?
No.
Okay. I want to talk to you about the gunshot wound to the head a little bit. We saw pictures that it was just above his right eyebrow, right?
Yes.
And that was where what you would describe as the entry wound,
Yes.
meaning that's where it went in.
Yes.
And there was no exit wound, right?
From the head, right.
Okay. And an exit wound is something where the bullet actually, or the projectile, leaves the body.
Yes.
And you can tell because you can see the wound where it left.
Yes.
And in this case, there was no exit wound.
Right.
And typically, when you recovered the bullet, right?
Yes.
We saw a picture of that.
Yes.
And you know that it was a .25 caliber?
Yes.
And you know that it was not a hollow point bullet, right?
I believe so. I'm not the ballistics person who would look at the bullet in detail.
Okay, but you believe it was not a hollow point.
That's correct.
All right. And that was recovered in his left cheek.
Yes.
Given all the autopsies that you've done, and you said you've done hundreds with regard to bullet wounds, right?
Yes.
So you've dealt with different types of bullets,
Yes.
different types of calibers,
Yes.
and there are some caliber of bullets that are much stronger, higher velocity bullets.
Not on the basis of just the caliber, but in terms of that's the mass of the bullet is the caliber. So some of them are fired at a higher velocity than others, but it's not necessarily dependent on the caliber.
Okay. And sometimes, and when you deal with entry and exit wounds, when there's no exit wound, that means typically there was not enough velocity for it to get out of the body.
But it also means that it delivered all of its energy to the structure that it injured. So if it stops in the body, there may be even more damage.
And when you deal with higher velocity projectiles, those higher velocity projectiles are more likely going to make an exit wound, right?
Depends on the projectile. Rifle rounds will tend to fragment and stay in the body.
Okay. I heard you say it depends on the projectile. What I'm
Yes.
talking about is a projectile that's fired at a higher velocity, that's going to cause an exit wound, right?
Not always.
More
Rifle-
likely than a lower velocity bullet, right?
Rifle rounds are very high velocity rounds that tend to fragment and stay in the body.
I'm not talking about fragments.
You're asking about high caliber and high velocity rounds.
Right. What I'm asking you, it's just a simple question, is when we're talking about higher velocity projectiles, not fragmenting, okay? Higher velocity projectiles have a tendency are more likely to leave an exit wound than a lower velocity projectile.
It depends on the projectile. So a same projectile fired at a higher velocity, that would be true. So given a 25 fired at a slow or a high velocity, the higher velocity will tend to exit. But some high velocity rounds are designed to fragment and stay in the body.
Okay. What I hear you saying is that a higher velocity is going to tend to exit more often than a lower velocity, something that's being fired at a lower velocity.
For the same projectile, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, you talked about the trajectory, right, of the bullet?
Through the body, through the head, yes.
Okay. Then we know that it came in from the right side and down and to the left.
Yes, down into the left cheek, yes.
So you said, so it very briefly enters into the frontal lobe of the brain. Is that what you're telling us?
I don't know what you mean by briefly. It does pass through the frontal lobe.
Okay.
It's a
Well,
bullet.
it's not far back into the head, right? The bullet.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. It's going through the brain, so,
Right. Well, the brain is divided into several different regions, isn't it?
right.
Okay.
Yes.
And we're talking about the frontal region.
Yes,
Okay. The frontal region is in the very front of the brain, right?
yes,
And that's broken up into two lobes,
yes.
front and left, or right and left.
Right and left.
Okay. And what we're talking about specifically is the right frontal lobe, correct?
Yes, yes.
So when I ask you whether or not the bullet went through the back of the brain doesn't include the frontal lobe.
That's right.
Okay. So it just, as far as what your opinion is that it went through the right frontal lobe.
The path of the bullet itself, yes.
Yes. When the bullet enters just above the eyebrow, that's in the scalp region, right?
Yes,
And the scalp scalp wounds tend to bleed, don't they?
Yes.
I guess bleed a lot more than other places.
It depends on the wound. So if you have a penetrating wound of the head, you may have more bleeding into the head than out.
Okay. But I've always heard that scalp wounds bleed a lot. Is that
Lacerations and cuts, yes, they will bleed because the only place they can go is out because there's no hole in the skull.
okay? And as the bullet is going along its path that you described for us, it's going to cause bleeding through that. Hemorrhaging?
Generally, yes.
And the bullet, you told us that it was lodged into his left cheek, right? That's above his mouth area, right?
Yes.
Okay, it didn't go through his mouth.
No.
But where in relation to the maxillary sinus did it go?
It goes through so the maxilla is this bone, your cheekbone. It goes through that bone, and there's a sinus in there. It's a hollow cavity in the bone, so we have sinuses in our skull. And they drain into the nasal passages and the mouth, which I'm anticipating your next question.
Okay, so the bullet went through the maxillary sinus?
Yes.
Okay, at that hollow cavity area?
Yes.
All right, and you said that the sinus drains into the nose and then into the mouth?
Yes.
All right, and you told us already that the bullet is going to cause bleeding as it goes through the head?
In most cases, yes.
All right. All right, so that bleeding that it's going to cause, let's assume for a second that your opinion is what Detective Flores said, which is that the bullet wound came first, okay?
Okay.
Assume that for a second. So if the bullet wound came first, then Mr. Alexander is alive at the time, correct?
Yes.
And when that bullet comes through, then it's going to cause bleeding into his sinus, right?
Yes.
Which then is going to go into his mouth or into his nose. The blood.
Most often, depending on where the head is laying, yes.
Okay.
It could just go down the throat as well.
Up down the throat and out the mouth, potentially.
Or just down the throat if he's in a sitting up position or some other position that won't allow drainage out.
Well, if the person's alive though and the blood is draining into their nose, it can also come in through the back of their into their throat area and out their mouth. They're going to cough, right?
It can, yes.
Okay. And the bullet wound, the entry wound, you said that's going to bleed too, right? Some inside, some outside.
Yes. In a living person.
In a living person. And so again, if we're assuming what Detective Flores said, that you told him that the gunshot wound was first, Mr. Alexander would have been living at the time.
Yes.
All right. And you would expect to see blood coming from the entrance wound, wouldn't you?
Yes.
And it could be enough, given that it's a scalp wound, it could certainly be enough that the blood's going to be dripping out.
Yes.
And when the blood then goes through the sinus and into the nasal and in the mouth, you could expect to see blood then coming out the nose.
Yes.
And if somebody were to cough or aspirate, you're going to see the blood splatter out of the nose, right?
Yes.
I'm showing you exhibit number 98. It's a picture of a sink. I understand. Were you ever at the scene?
No.
Okay. So on the left-hand side of the picture, we can see blood droplets, right? You'd agree with that?
Yes.
And on the top of the picture, towards the back of the sink, we see more of a spray type of blood. You'd agree with that, right?
Yes.
And so if Mr. Alexander was standing over the sink after the bullets, after he gets hit with the bullets, if he's standing over the sink, it wouldn't be unreasonable, would it, that the blood from his forehead would be dropping onto the sink?
I don't think it's reasonable because I don't believe he'd be standing at the sink with a bullet hole in his head.
Right, that's right. Because you think he'd be immediately unconscious.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, do me a favor for a second. Assume that he wouldn't be immediately unconscious. Okay? Just assume that for a second. If he wasn't immediately unconscious and he was able to stand at the sink, you would imagine that blood could be dripping from the entry wound, right?
Assuming that's true, but I disagree with that.
I understand, but I'm just asking you to assume it.
Sure?
Okay. And you know that the blood, and like you said, the blood is going to go through the nasal cavity, right?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that you look at during your examination is for stippling, right?
Yes.
What is stippling?
Stippling is if you have a gunshot wound of a certain distance, some burning pieces of gunpowder will come out of the end of the firearm and will stipple the tissue around the hole. So you'll actually see little abrasions, little dot-like abrasions, and pieces of gunpowder that are sort of stuck into the hole, into the little tiny holes around the gunshot wound, and it gives us an idea about a range of fire.
And typically you see stippling when the range of fire is closer, right?
We would categorize it as intermediate. So a close range, you usually only see soot, which is the powdery material around the wound, but you won't see stippling. And then if it's a little further away, then you'll start to see stippling, but no soot. And then if you see neither of those, then it's either a distant shot or there's some object in between the shooter and the victim.
All right. And I just want to explain a little bit more about that. So when you talk about the soot, and you talk the soot, how close are we talking? Like the muzzle to the head?
It depends on the weapon, but generally it's not, the gun is not on the surface. It's a little bit away, maybe an inch or 2 or 3, and you'll see just soot. If it's a little further away than the soot, it's just smoke. It just blows away, and you'll have the stippling particles or the thing that hits.
And a little further away is what to you?
A few inches to a few feet, depending on the weapon.
Okay. And if you don't see either of those, then you can conclude it wasn't that close or there was something in between.
Right, and we call this indeterminate because we don't know. It's either distant range or there is an object or some sort of screening that's keeping that from happening or from hitting the skin.
Okay. And in this particular case, you didn't see any stippling, right?
No,
And you didn't see any soot?
no.
And you certainly didn't see any damage that would have suggested that the muzzle of the gun was touching.
Right. Contact gunshot wound, usually you'll have tearing of the skin around the wound, like it looks like a star, and we didn't see that in this case.
All right, I want to talk to you about the wounds on the back, okay? You talked briefly about how it's a grouping, right? There's 9 stab wounds on the back.
Yes.
I'm showing you exhibit wound number 193. And you call it a grouping because why?
They're clustered together.
Okay. And you see this just in between the shoulders, right?
Yes.
And these are, in your terms, considered shallow cuts.
They're shallow stab wounds, yes.
All right. Now the group in the center are more of a straight in stab wound. Is that correct?
They have that appearance that they're more straight into the body.
Okay. And when we're talking about straight in versus coming in at an angle, we're talking about the track of the instrument, right?
Yes.
So we're not talking about the fact that this one is turned to the right or turned to the left.
Right. We're talking about the actual trajectory of the knife in this case.
Okay. And you know that, which ones are the straight ones? Can you point out to us?
For the most part, the 6 clustered in the middle look more like they're straight-on wounds, and then these 3 to the side, the difference between them is that you can see this gray tissue on the side there, and that to me tells me that the blade is sort of coming in a little bit sideways because that tissue is exposed on that side.
Okay. And it's coming in sideways, going in from right to left. Is that correct?
His right to the left of the body, yes.
His right to
His left.
Okay. Now you'd agree with me that if there were 2 people who were standing face to face, one of them has a knife and is shorter than the other. If the person who has the knife is left-handed and reaching over top of the other person and hitting that other person with the knife on their back, there's going to be less force involved in that type of a cut, right?
It'd be more difficult to do that, yes.
Okay. And if a person, and when I say less force, I guess what we're talking about really is if a person is actually standing, if the person with the knife is standing behind another person and they're able to actually just go all in with the force, like the force that we talked about earlier, that the knife or the instrument went in about 5 inches,
Yes.
right? You would suggest, if somebody's standing straight behind, that would make it easier to use more force, right?
Yes, especially if we're talking about someone reaching up and over a taller individual.
That would require
That'd
less
be more
force.
awkward, right? It'd be harder to apply more force in that situation.
Okay. And less force causes shallower wounds, typically, right?
Generally, it depends on the sharpness of the weapon, too. I mean, it may require very little force at all if the weapon's very sharp.
Well, typically in your experience, more force is going to cause deeper wounds.
Right.
And so the opposite would be true as well.
Yes.
I want to talk to you about the particular stab wound that was you discussed to the vena cava.
Yes.
Okay. Now that particular wound we saw was in the upper chest area.
Yes.
And you said that that one was eventually fatal.
In and of itself, it would have eventually caused death without medical attention. Right.
And that would have been due to blood loss?
Yes.
Now that trajectory, you had a chance to look at the trajectory of that, correct? Do you want to refer to your report? Yes.
If I could, please. Yes.
That one has a slightly upper trajectory, doesn't it?
Slightly upward to reach the heart, yes.
Okay. So in other words, when we're talking again about trajectory, we're talking about that particular knife or that particular instrument then moving slightly upward as it's going in.
Yes, but the only complication there is that it does pass through the cartilage of the chest, so that can deflect the blade up and down as it goes in. So there may be some difference with that.
Well, and with the trajectory, one of the things you looked at is the undermined edge, right? The lower undermined edge?
On the wound to the chest?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, can you tell us what that is?
Again, if you look at if you recall the pictures of the back injuries, if you just see a slit and no tissue on either side, then you can conclude that the knife has gone straight in. If you see fatty tissue on one side and not on the other, then you can conclude that the knife has gone in at an angle. And in this case, if there's an upward edge, meaning that the lower part of the tissue, that's where it's visible, it means that the knife has gone slightly upwards.
Okay, so in this particular instance, you did see this edging that you're talking about.
I believe if I could see the photo again, it would help me with recollection.
Let me see if I can find it. $186.
Right. Okay, so this is a close-up of the wound, and what you're seeing here is you can see an edge of white tissue at the bottom of the wound, but you don't see it at the top, so that tells you that the knife is going upward slightly.
Is that the one that goes to vena cava? You want a more?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's the lower wound. But it's a similar concept here. So here you can see reflecting tissue here. So both of these actually are trending upward, but the one of the lowermost wound is the one that goes to the heart.
Okay. And when you say trending upward, then that means that the instrument would be going upward as it's going in, right?
At least at the point where it's injuring the skin itself, yes.
Okay. And you'd agree with me then that if somebody is sitting down and the person with the knife is standing over top of them, it would be more difficult to have an upper trajectory if you were to stab somebody in the chest in that situation.
It would
That's your lack
depend.
of foundation is the difficulty of stabbing someone.
Overruled. You may answer.
I've never stabbed anybody, but if you can hold a knife one of two ways. You can do an overhand stab like this, or you can do an underhand stab like that. If you do an underhand stab, even for a seated person, if you're coming from below them, you can have an upward trajectory on the knife.
Yes, and that's my question. If you're not coming from below them, if you're standing and the person is seated, it would make it difficult to end up with an upper trajectory.
Again, it depends on how the knife is held. And we're talking about a short person and a taller person sitting in a chair. I don't know where those heights would match up.
Oh, okay. Let's just assume then that the taller person is sitting in the shower, so there's no chair, okay? They're sitting on the ground, and the shorter person is standing outside the shower, okay? And we're looking at, hold on one second. I'm showing you Exhibit 160. Okay, this is a person in a shower, so you can assume that that's the ground.
Okay.
Okay, so if a person is sitting like that with their arms forward, and you have somebody standing over that person with a knife, it would be difficult if that person then is trying to get into this area with a stab with an upward trajectory, wouldn't it be?
Right. Assuming those facts are true, yes, that would be difficult to do.
Okay. And that's just something that you wouldn't expect to see as a medical examiner.
No.
The other thing about that particular wound to the vena cava is that's not something that's going to bleed into the mouth like a bullet wound through the sinus, right?
There's no direct connection to the airways or the lungs with that injury.
Okay. So a stab wound then, that particular stab wound, you're not going to expect, knowing what you know about the body, you're not going to expect blood to enter in through the nose or the mouth.
No. With that wound, no.
I'm going to talk to you about the wound to the neck, okay? That is, you told us that's rapidly fatal.
Yes.
And rapidly to is within a few seconds, or I'm sorry, a few minutes, right?
Consciousness lost within seconds and likely death within minutes.
I'm sorry, you're speaking so lowly.
I'm sorry. Consciousness within a few seconds,
Okay.
and then death within a few minutes.
Okay. So once the person is unconscious after a few seconds, they're not going to become conscious again, right?
With an injury like this, no.
After an injury like that, after the person loses consciousness, you wouldn't expect to see that person be able to do any type of purposeful actions, right?
As I testified on direct, he may have a few seconds of being able to get his hands up or continue an action, but really only a few seconds worth. So consciousness implies, purposeful action if he had an action that he was continuing.
Okay. And so after those few seconds, you're not going to expect that person to move, basically.
They may convulse, but they're not going to be conscious or purposeful.
Okay. And when a person has a neck wound like that, when they have a neck wound like that and they're unconscious, they don't have the ability to sit up straight, right?
Doubtful. No.
Okay. And they don't have the ability to keep their head up straight anymore.
Correct.
And so most likely in a wound like that, the head is going to either tip forward or tip backwards.
Yes.
And typically, I'm sure in your experience, typically deceased people, if they're seated in a seated position, they're not sitting up straight.
Most of the time, no.
Okay. And typically deceased people, if they're in a seated position, they would be slumping.
Yes.
And in this situation, with a neck wound like that, not only would they be slumping, but their neck or their head would be either forward or back, certainly not straight up. And if if a deceased person were dragged, let's say, down a hallway of about 12 feet, and dragged about 12 feet down a hallway, okay? That person, it would be very difficult to sit that person up, wouldn't it?
Depends on how
Just the
strong
lack
you
of
are.
foundation setting people up in this circumstance.
Who said he has the experience?
Overruled. You may answer if you can.
I'm sorry.
It would be very difficult to prop somebody like that up, right? Because they can't do it themselves anymore.
Right, you're talking about another person propping them up?
Yes,
Again, it would depend on who you were and how strong you were.
Okay. And when we look at the wound track of the bullet wound, to get something that just goes through the very frontal area, right? Because we know it didn't go through the middle of the head or the back of the head, right?
Right.
And we know that it wasn't a shot from the front of the head that went to the back of the head, right?
Right.
So it was obviously a shot somehow from the side, right?
Well, it's actually from the front side.
The front side.
Yes.
Right. But when you say front, what I want to distinguish is it's not front and where the bullet goes straight onto the back.
That's not the trajectory, it's through the back. It's from the forehead, from the front, but it goes down and then ends up in the cheek.
Okay. And if a person were dragged 12 feet down a hallway and they were lying, a deceased person, and they were lying on the hallway, to get that type of a wound track would be difficult, wouldn't it?
You're talking about a person lying on their back being shot in this position?
Yes.
It wouldn't be difficult.
Okay. The person who was doing the shooting, wouldn't they need to actually get down closer to get that type of wound track?
No.
I mean, you can't, if a person is lying there on the floor and the other person then is shooting them, if they're just typically shoot somebody like this, that you're not going to get that type of wound track.
Agreed. It depends on the position of the head. Depends on also the deflection of the bullet passing through the skull. But the wound is to the front of the forehead.
Right. But if a person is standing, okay, the live person is standing, and the deceased person is on the ground lying flat, okay? If the person, we've already discussed the fact that that person is going to be very difficult to sit that person up, right? The deceased person.
Again, it depends on the person who's moving the body.
So the person who's moving the body would have to be somewhat strong to get a deceased person to move around, right?
If they're smaller than the person, yes.
Well, especially if they're smaller, right?
Right.
And if they weighed about 80 pounds less, it would be more difficult for them to manipulate a deceased person, right?
Depending on what their position was originally. Yeah.
It would.
Yes.
Okay. And so if a person is lying on the ground, let's assume for a second that they've just been dragged down a hallway, so they're lying face up on the ground, okay?
Yes.
If a person were to stand, if a live person were to stand over that deceased person and just simply shoot, when the head is facing the person, you're not going to get that type of impact.
I disagree. If you have a person who's laying on the ground and you're standing slightly behind the head or in front of the head and you just shoot down into the head, you can get this type of wound track. You're going to have deflection of the bullet as it passes through the bone.
Okay, so in order to get that type of wound track, then the live person would have to get down closer by the head or somehow manage it so that you can specifically get that wound track, right?
Again, I don't understand your line of reasoning here.
That's what I'm hearing you say, is that you're saying you can get that wound track, but in order to get that type of trajectory of the bullet that just crosses through the front of the facial area, in order to get that type of trajectory, you're telling us that the person would have to specifically aim the gun in that area.
Or put the head and if the head's off to the side or either side, we don't know what the position of the head is when it's shot. So you could, as long as you're up near the upper part of the body, you could shoot from almost any angle and get this, depending on where his head is. So it's not difficult at all. I can't.
What I'm telling you though is that, what I'm asking you to assume is the person is lying flat, face up.
But I follow
The
you.
head isn't moved around. The
Okay,
person
so
is
flat,
face up, so the
staring
face is
straight up at the
facing-
ceiling?
Yes.
Again, if you're standing off to the side or you aim straight down, you can get a wound like this.
If you aim straight down, the bullet's going to go across the face rather than straight through in.
Well, you're going through bone and you're going with a small caliber deformed projectile. It's been deformed by the bone itself. So there's no reason to assume that you couldn't get this type of trajectory from a wound like that.
All right. The track of the bullet, I have a question for you, actually. Another question. When you were examining the body, did you put the brain in formalin?
No.
What is formalin?
Formalin is formaldehyde. It's the substance or fluid that we'll put tissue in to harden it a bit so we can try to examine it.
Why didn't you do that?
Because the brain was so decomposed, it wouldn't have helped. You can only use formalin really on non-decomposed tissue to try to reconstitute it to the point where you can section it.
Okay, so you didn't attempt to do that at all?
No.
All right. I know that you've been referring to your reports. Which report is that? Is that your original report or is that your addenda?
I'm looking at the amended. That's in evidence.
Okay. And your amended one was actually written on December 6th of 2013, is that right?
Yes.
You originally wrote a report back in June of 2008, correct?
Yes.
And for the most part, they're the same, aren't they?
Yes.
During the autopsy, you'd agree that Detective Flores was present, right?
According to the records I have, yes, he was there.
Okay. And do you recall being interviewed by defense counsel for this case in 2011?
Yes.
And prior to that interview, you would have reviewed your report to prepare for the interview, right? Because like you said, you've done close to 6,000 autopsies. You need to refresh your recollection, right?
Yes.
And so in 2013, you testified in this trial, right?
Yes.
And in fact, and prior to your testimony, you would have reviewed the report again?
Yes.
And you testified in January of 2013, right?
Yes.
And then you testified again for a second time in April of 2013.
Yes.
And prior to testifying again, you would have reviewed your report, because that was like 4 months later.
Yes.
And then you testified again in May of 2013.
Right.
And you would have reviewed your report again prior to getting up on the stand?
Probably, yes.
Just like you did today, right?
Yes.
I'm sure you looked at your reports, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. And in your reports, you examined the brain, right?
Yes.
And in your report, you note that in examining the brain, you didn't see any obvious evidence of significant intracranial hemorrhage.
That's right.
Can you tell us what that means, generally?
I saw no bleeding within the skull.
Okay. So you couldn't see any damage?
There's 2 holes in the skull and the overlying dura, which is what's reflected in the amended report. But I did not see a wound track, a defined bleeding track through the brain.
Okay. And you also noted in your report that there was no obvious evidence of apparent cerebral or brain injury, right?
That's right.
Just based on somebody reading those 2 things, you might get the idea that the bullet actually didn't go through the brain, right? Just on reading those 2 things.
Right. Out of context, yes.
Also, during the autopsy, you were able to take, you sectioned the brain?
With a knife, yes, I was able to cut the brain as it was.
And you do that to do what? Why do you do that?
For the most part, when you have a decomposed brain, you're looking for large things like tumors. You're looking for bullet fragments, things that are going to be obvious on a decomposed brain. But obviously, in a decomposed state, you don't always see all that much.
All right. And you told us in your report that after looking through the brain, through the sectioning of it, there was no apparent trauma. Is that right?
That's right.
It's just like a good time to stop.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take the noon recess. Please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition. Are there any questions? Have a nice lunch.
All right.
You may step down. Counsel, please approach. No, not yet. Is Beth Karras here? Could you please come forward? Good afternoon. Just have a seat right here in one of the chairs.
Could we have her sworn, please, Your Honor?
All right, Ms. Karras, the attorneys are asking that you be sworn. Why don't you come over here and be sworn? Yes, right over here.
Can you spell your last name for me? Last name? I swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
All right, please come around and have a seat. All right, Ms. Karras, it was reported to me that during the break this morning that one of the jurors approached you. Is that correct?
Yes,
And was that juror number 9?
yes. It's the one I can see best.
All right.
The last one.
Would you describe what happened?
I was outside just giving a couple of sound bites to Chris Williams, Channel 12. He just wanted me to contrast sort of the scene in the courtroom and outside this year compared to last year. I gave him a couple of pretty innocuous, little bit substantive bites, but nothing to do with evidence in the case. There were some of the court watchers who were regulars last year. This year they're back, who were also outside nearby, smoking cigarettes. As soon as we finished, I looked beyond them. Just a few feet from them was juror number 9. And I said to everybody, stop talking. There's a juror. She was not wearing her badge. I looked for it. She went in. I followed some distance behind, but we caught up to each other after going through security. And while I was getting my bag, some feet from her, she turned to me and she said, "Are you Nancy Grace?" And I said, "No, but I used to work with her." And that was it. She said, "You look familiar." That was it.
All right. Follow up? Anything from the state?
Why did you follow her into the building?
Pardon me?
Why did you follow her into the building if you didn't want to have any contact with her?
Why did I call? I can't understand.
Why did you follow her into the building if you
Oh,
didn't
I was just going in.
Hold on.
Court was
Hold
resuming.
on. Let me finish my question. If you didn't want to have any contact with her, why did you follow her into the building?
I wasn't, I mean, it was just the natural flow. Court was resuming, so I gave her a head start. And I even said to one of the deputies downstairs, "Is that a juror? I think that's a juror." And he said, "I don't know." But I wasn't following her. I did not want to engage with her. However, we were at that table where you get your bags, and she was about 5 feet from me. And she turned to me, and I thought, well, do I just ignore her? I'm not an attorney in the case. I know the rules. I mean, I used to be an assistant. I'm a licensed attorney. I know the rules. And so I said, no. I used to work with her, and that was it. But I did not, I mean, I technically was following her, but I wasn't following her to talk to her. I did not want to engage her in conversation.
I don't have anything else.
Mr. Nermi, Ms. Wilmot?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Karras.
Yes. Good afternoon.
Ma'am, this conversation you had with Mr. Williams, he's with a local NBC affiliate, correct? Is that a yes?
Yes,
She needs
yes.
to-
And it's got air tomorrow, he said.
Okay. And by air, was this filmed?
Yeah.
This was a filmed videotaped interview?
And
Okay.
he operated the camera. It was just Chris and me.
Okay. And you said that things were wrapping up when the time that this encounter took place,
Yes.
correct? Okay. And you've been a professional broadcaster for a long time, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I just want to make sure when we're being specific here about wrapping things up, are you aware whether or not Mr. Williams' cameraman, I'm assuming he had one, he wasn't filming it himself, correct?
No, he did,
Oh,
actually.
Mr. Williams filmed it himself?
Yes.
Okay. And so you don't know what was in his screenshot, who he might have been filming apart from?
Oh, no, I was facing the juror. The camera was the other direction. The camera was facing the street. I was facing the juror. And that's when I said, oh, that's a juror over there. Stop talking, but we were finished filming.
Okay. So he puts the camera down, right, well, before this woman approaches? I'm just trying to get
She
an
didn't
understanding.
approach. She stayed at her distance, and I just said to everybody, that's a juror over there, and everybody scattered. It was time to go into court because the break was over. She didn't approach. She was standing over there.
Okay. She was in your vision while you were doing this interview. Is that accurate?
I didn't notice her till after the interview, but she was probably 10, 12 feet away.
Okay. You didn't know who it was, but you saw her standing there.
I saw her standing when he put the camera down, the interview was over, I looked over and I said, there's a juror.
So she was in close enough proximity that she could have heard what was going on in this interview.
I don't know that she could have heard me, but she certainly would have heard the court watchers who were standing around, probably having a conversation
Okay.
in a public space.
When you say, again, I'm not casting aspersions on it, trying to figure out what happened. When you say court watchers having a conversation in a public space, where was this conversation taking place relative to this juror?
They're in the bench area, just to the, if you're facing them, just to the right of the juror. And she was feet away.
Okay, so she would have been within earshot of their conversation.
I would say yes.
Okay. And I know you are a relatively soft-spoken individual, but Mr. Williams maybe is not. Could she have heard, in your estimation, could she have heard the things and the questions Mr. Williams was asking?
He would have been projecting away, and he asked me 2 questions. I would have projected toward her. He projected away from her. His back was to her.
And for specificity here, since we don't have a tape yet, what did he ask you?
He asked me the difference between the scene in and outside the courthouse last year compared to this year. I answered, and he said it's more of a social media scene now. And I said, yeah, there's a lot of interest in social media. People who are Travis Alexander supporters and followers of the trial want to know the end of it. And there's a lot of activity on social media. Not as much at the courthouse, which I predict may change as the case.
And that was basically your answers to
Yeah,
Mr. Williams? what you
that's
just-
all I needed, yeah.
Okay. And now I'm familiar with this area where we come in. Did this juror go in ahead of you or after you?
She went in ahead.
Okay. And it was while you were waiting for your bags that she approaches you and says, "Are you Nancy Grace?"
Well, we're both at the table.
Right, okay, right. You're at the
She just
table.
turned to me and she said, "Are you Nancy Grace?" And I said, "No." Not the first time I've had that question. And she just said, "You look familiar." And I said, "I used to work with her." That was it.
And did you walk away? Did she walk away? How did the
Walked away.
conversation end?
She walked away. I waited for her to get ahead of me, and then I continued. Well, actually, I talked to another member of the media who was coming out, a friend of mine.
Did you see her have contact with any of these other individuals, these trial watchers, or Mr.
She was
Williams?
alone. No, she was alone. And I actually didn't see her talk to anyone outside either. She was just in earshot, and she wasn't wearing her badge. That's what concerned me.
Understood. Thank you, Ms. Kerr.
Anything else, Mr. Martinez?
No.
All right, thank you, Ms. Karras. You may step down. Counsel, please approach. At recess until 1:30.